All right, so good morning. Happy December 1st, and welcome to the December 2020 edition of the Philanthropy Club. We've got a great program. Before we get started, I thought it'd be good to have Lisa Mae Simpson, who is Forefront's Vice President for Learning and Engagement, to welcome you because she is our sponsor and a very wonderful sponsor. So, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Rich. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy Giving Tuesday to those of you participating. I know that today is a very busy day for fundraising professionals, so we appreciate you taking some time to be with us. As Rich said, my name is Lisa Mae Simpson. I get to serve as the Vice President for Learning and Engagement at Forefront. If you're not familiar with us, we are a statewide association. Our mission is to create a vibrant social impact sector for all the people of Illinois. And we do that by partnering with grant makers like the MacArthur Foundation. We're grateful to have Tara with us today, as well as operating nonprofits and advisors. And I know I'm looking at the list of folks who are joining us today. I know that all of our major stakeholder groups are represented. So we're thrilled that you're all here. We are also thrilled, in case you hadn't heard the news, that we got to announce recently that Monique Brunson Jones, most recently of the Evanston Community Foundation, will be joining us as our new CEO in January. So we're really looking forward to welcoming her and digging further into our mission and finding out with her how we can best continue to support you all. If you are interested in finding more of our resources, I hope you'll look at our website. We have, over the last 8 to 9 months, really built out a pretty robust repository of COVID-19 specific, sorry, my cat is having a moment, resources that I hope you'll find useful. Our library, while physically closed, is still staffed by 2 professional librarians who are servicing our members with reference and research request support. So we are here. We are we're scattered throughout the state as we were before. We do have staff in Chicago, Springfield, and Galesburg. So we are, but we're all working virtually and eager to support all of you. So glad to be hosting the Philanthropy Club. We were just talking about it. It turns out we just passed the 2-year mark that we've gotten to host this wonderful group. So glad to be able to do that and to support these conversations that you all have. So I'm going to turn it back over to Rich so we can get into what you actually came to hear, which is to learn more about MacArthur and Tara's work there. So thanks again for joining us. Hope we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Elisa. That was great. I just have a couple brief thank yous. I also want to thank Forefront's Key Montgomery, who is behind the scenes making all this possible. She's doing an awesome job. I also want to thank David off Mission Driven Business Strategy for being sponsors. And a special shout out to Gus Wilhelmi, who's the founder of the Philanthropy Club, who now resides in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, which is a real place. So we're very fortunate to have Tara Magner from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation with us today. Tara is the Director of Chicago Commitment at the Foundation, which it's a position that she's held since January of 2016. Prior to that, at the Foundation, she served as a program officer in the U.S. programs area focusing on migration and policy research. She's going to be talking about the exciting multi-foundation commitment of 1.7 billion, as in the $1 billion, to nonprofits in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just very quickly before I turn things over to Tara, and I know this is in the chat, but I just want to briefly go over Zoom etiquette. And that is in the Q&A. I would suggest if you want to use that to identify yourself and your affiliation for anybody else that's participating, that's great. And in the Q&A section, obviously put your questions. And there will be a couple times when Tara will stop for questions. I will do my best to field them. I suspect I won't be able to get to all of them, but I will do my best. So I'm going to turn things over to Tara, and she's going to give you a little bit of background about herself before she gets into the matter at hand. So Tara, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I'm just getting my screens organized here. Rich asked me to say a few words about myself before jumping into the presentation. So I will start with that, but also want to take a moment to say thank you to all of you for joining today, to Rich for inviting me, and to Key and to Lisa for helping us organize this event. It's delightful to be with you all. It feels a little strange to see none of you. I'm sure there are many wonderful friends and colleagues out in the audience, and good morning to everyone. Just a quick word about myself. As Rich mentioned, I came to MacArthur several years ago. I had been working in Washington, D.C. for several years in the United States Senate, specifically on the Judiciary Committee for Patrick Leahy, who in various times was either the chairman or the ranking Democrat on that committee. And my work for him involved immigration and refugee protection, national security, and as is true for any Hill staffer, a variety of other issues from time to time. I did 2 stints there with Senator Leahy on the committee, totaling about 8.5 years. But in between those 2 stints, I was here in Chicago working as the policy director at the National Immigrant Justice Center, and then joined MacArthur in April of 2012. I started there in the migration program, a program that MacArthur ran for several years, but took on a new iteration in 2012, where for the first time it focused on US immigration policy, as well as regional migration between the US, Mexico, and Central America, and international migration with a special focus on protecting those individuals who don't fall under the Refugee Convention. So people who might be displaced by conflict, by natural disaster, or by climate change, et cetera. As foundations sometimes do, that our board decided to wind down that program. And so in 2016, MacArthur was redesigning its local work, and I moved over to lead what we now call the Chicago Commitment Team. And I'm very happy to take questions about that team's work at the end of this presentation, but I will jump over to our main theme at this point. Let me now try to screen share, and please let me know if this looks all right to you all. Can you see the slides? Yes? Okay, wonderful. Excellent. All right, so as you know, as Rich just mentioned, earlier in the summer, the MacArthur Foundation and a few other national foundations announced that they would commit $1.7 billion to nonprofit organizations in the wake of the pandemic. And that was spurred by the fact that the pandemic, the economic crisis, and recent civil unrest shone a bright light on the deep inequality and racism in the United States and the systems that uphold that racism. Philanthropy is being called upon to meet this moment by funding racial and social justice movements that drive deep and lasting change. To hasten an equitable recovery in the wake of the pandemic, MacArthur is committed to reimagining what is possible. And so today I'll talk about the MacArthur Foundation's Equitable Recovery Initiative. First, I'll start with a description of the plans announced by those 5 foundations in June to respond to the dual impact of persistent racial inequities and the challenges related to COVID-19 recovery. Some donors, including MacArthur, took the unusual step of selling bonds to raise new money and pledged to allocate that money toward racial and ethnic equity. Collectively, the 5 foundations made a commitment to increase their payout to nonprofit organizations with more than $1.7 billion in new funding. Then I'll shift over and talk about some of the initial grants that MacArthur made using the proceeds of those bond sales. And then finally, I'll describe the process we're following at this moment, drawing on the advice of external advisors in a participatory process to determine how to deploy the remaining funds. This presentation is about 20 minutes total. I'll stop about halfway through for questions, and then of course take additional questions at the end. The COVID-19 pandemic presents a threat to the global economy, global health, and our well-being. The confluence of historic crises have exposed deep racial and socioeconomic disparities and inequities that take a disproportionate toll on people of color and other historically marginalized communities. In the early days of the pandemic, African Americans were particularly affected with higher death rates than other groups. Soon after, as you all know, here in Chicago, our Latino, Latina, Latinx community was very hard hit as well. Those rates have persisted. As of last month, November 2020, more than 74% of COVID-19 deaths in the city of Chicago represented the Black and Latinx population, laying bare the racial disparities in health that pre-existed the pandemic. In the United States, of course, we also continue to see and experience anti-Black violence at the hands of police and some civilians. Early this year, in those early days of the pandemic, there was a growing call for philanthropy to do more in the moment. MacArthur contributed to the Chicago Community COVID-19 Response Fund and the Illinois COVID-19 Response Fund, both of which offered immediate relief to families and emergency response to organizations. The MacArthur Foundation also joined with others in the philanthropic community to create the Arts for Illinois Relief Fund and the Chicago COVID-19 Journalism Fund. And while the foundation acted quickly in the spring of this year to respond to that immediate crisis, we believed across the foundation staff and board that it would be important for MacArthur to make a commitment beyond emergency grant making. I will advance the slides in just a moment, Rich. I don't have many slides, but they're sort of scheduled to be dropped in here and there. Last spring, the foundation's president, John Palfrey, began a conversation with the board, making the argument that given the unprecedented nature of the global pandemic and the consequences for vulnerable and historically marginalized communities in the United States, it was essential that the foundation allocate additional funds beyond our typical annual spending. And so to meet that moment, MacArthur's board approved a one-time $125 million bond offering to raise new funds for grant making. Those funds will be used in addition to our standard grant making budgets over the next 2 to 3 years. Let me see. There we go. In response to the pandemic and civil unrest of last summer, the MacArthur Foundation will focus on supporting the reinvention of systems that create a more just, equitable, and resilient world. This moment of massive disruption can bring us together. It presents an opportunity for a growing mass movement for change. Therefore, in June, MacArthur, along with 4 other national foundations, jointly announced a commitment to increase their payouts to nonprofit organizations. They agreed to give more than $1.7 billion combined within the next 3 years to help stabilize and sustain a nonprofit sector facing devastating economic impacts due to the global pandemic and the epidemic of social injustice. The 4 other philanthropies are the Doris Charitable Foundation, the Ford Foundation, W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. The financial commitment of each foundation represented new funding above their previously approved budgets. Each of these five foundations will determine priorities for the distribution of new funds based on their own guidelines and priorities. In their press releases in June, each described how they would dedicate funds. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation will step up its support to human services, public health, medical research, environmental, and arts and culture organizations at a time when the need is greatest. It will work to provide additional support to organizations with an eye toward addressing inequities and facilitating long-term recovery. The Ford Foundation made the largest pledge of $1 billion. It will support and strengthen nonprofit organizations hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, said, quote, "The proceeds from this offering will help build the resilience and durability of nonprofits that will influence the recovery and reimagine a more just and inclusive society." The W.K. Kellogg Foundation, as I'm sure many of you know, has long had a focus on racial equity. It believes that post-pandemic, its grant recipients, communities, and partner organizations will need to be strong to reimagine and rebuild systems centered on racial equity. And then even before the pandemic, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation was the nation's largest funder of arts and culture and the humanities. Its president, Elizabeth Alexander, said that it will dramatically increase its grant making to organizations that are systemically under-resourced, guided by diverse and imaginative leadership, and fueled by the courage and vision we need in full force. These other foundations will release periodic updates on their plans. And in a moment, I'll come back to mention a specific program that the Ford Foundation announced this fall that will take place in Chicago in collaboration with several local funders. So let me pause here and address a question that you may have about this initiative. MacArthur, as you know, has a sizable endowment. So why would it sell bonds to raise funds? Why not simply pull money out of its endowment and use that for the additional grant making? The short answer is that low interest rates on borrowing, combined with MacArthur's high credit rating, allowed the foundation to raise funds quickly while preserving its grant-making power for the long term and maintaining operations. But I'd be happy if people have questions about that decision or that topic. I'd be happy to pause here and answer those questions before moving on to what we have been funding and what we believe we will be funding.
Tara, I have a question from Jackie Davidoff, which I think is pertinent. She writes, how will the outcomes of your significant investment be measured? And have you set specific goals for assessing what impact you seek in terms of impacting racial inequities and systemic racism?
Yes, excellent question. That is a project that we are developing right now with our external advisors. I'll explain more about the external advisors in a moment, but we have an internal evaluation team at MacArthur, and we have recruited about a dozen people to help us determine what to fund with the bond proceeds and also help us think through impact and measurement. And so I don't have a specific answer yet on the goals and measures because we haven't fully determined what will be funded, but it is part and parcel of the work that's being done now.
I don't see any others right now. I'm sure there'll be others later, so maybe you want to proceed.
Sure thing. And I'm happy to come back to the question about the bond proceeds and so on later if anyone has questions.
Actually, I'm sorry, Tara, we just have two questions that just came up, so I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
This is from Clark McCain. He asked, please elaborate on the decision to tap bond markets in a time when so many municipalities and other borrowers who do not have the luxury of a large corpus are needing to borrow in the capital markets. Why not draw from the corpus?
I confess I don't have a great answer on the comparison to municipalities. I am happy to take that back, Clark, and try to get a better answer for you on that portion of it. The general decision about selling bonds is really rooted in part in the volatility of the capital markets that we've seen since March. And I think that that many economists forecast that there could be continued volatility in the coming years. I believe that was a sense even before the COVID pandemic arrived. And so our board and our president and CFO thought that given the continued market uncertainty, the idea of the debt offering would be a more secure way for MacArthur to raise funds while maintaining the corpus for the long-term grant making, maintaining the existing programs that we have with their annual grant budgets and so on. Does that help answer the question? Mm-hmm.
We will have to assume so. I have two other questions for you. Mm-hmm. As you stated, MacArthur is committed to reimagining systems. Mm-hmm. In issuing bonds for grant making. Can you share how that commitment aligns with the bond strategy?
I think the answer is there was a desire to raise new and additional money, and a creative way of doing that was looking at selling the bonds over a long-term period. The thought was that there would be money could be raised quickly and given interest rates fairly inexpensively, and that new money could be put toward the reimagining work, COVID recovery, emergency response, and then rethinking partly what we fund, but also how we make those decisions.
Great, and here's another question. Will each foundation distribute funds, or is there a collaborative process? i.e., if we apply to one, we have applied to all for this initiative?
Each foundation is working independently. And so each of the 5 I mentioned had put out individual press releases back in June describing their plans for how they would use the funds that they raised. The one initiative that has involved at least MacArthur and Ford together, I'll talk about in a moment, is called America's Cultural Treasures. There are certainly things that I think these foundations will end up co-funding, but they are not operating in a concerted strategy overall.
Okay, a couple more questions. Will these funds be available for organizations that were established as a result of and to address inequity issues around COVID-19 and are still in the process of acquiring funding to become operational?
I think that is, I think in general, the answer would be yes. I can't imagine why they wouldn't be eligible, but the actual use, at least from MacArthur, the use of the bulk of the 125 million that we have raised is being determined by, in conversation with outside advisors. So the very specific planned uses of that funding have not been 100% determined.
Okay, I think we can move on maybe to the specific nature of MacArthur's work, if we, and then we'll get
Very
back
good.
to that.
Okay. All right. Excuse me. And so this approach, the selling of the bonds, is allowing MacArthur to be strategic, responsive, and deliberate in this new grant making. We anticipate having 3 areas of focus for the new funds. First, to hasten the equitable recovery. To do so, we will sustain and strengthen nonprofits and communities in the wake of COVID-19. The pandemic has ravaged some communities more than others and dramatically exposed underlying racial inequities. We are consulting with and seeking input from communities most affected, and we'll do our best to fund the work in the ways in which they request. For our second focused area of grant making, seizing the opportunity for transformation, we will support the self-determination and mobilization of people of color to engage and shift systems. We believe that civic participation, empowerment, and social entrepreneurship can improve representation and outcomes for communities. And the third area of work will explore further opportunities for impact. Innovation, creativity, and bold ideas often emerge in crisis. We are seeking new ways of thinking and working that can serve people in our city, our country, and global communities. And so let me turn now to an initial package of grants that MacArthur announced back in September. From that 125 million raised, there was a large package of 25 million in grants announced in September, and that had two pieces to it. It addressed anti-Black racism, Native Americans affected by COVID-19 in one package, and then a second package strengthened voter education mobilization and combated voter suppression in the recent election. Let me show it to you here. So again, that initial package of 25 million was divided thematically into 2 parts. The first 10 million was for communities most affected by the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism. And that set of grants amplified Native voices, supported the self-determination of Indigenous peoples, and provided COVID-19 relief to Indigenous communities across North America, the US, Mexico, and Canada. It also deployed resources to Black-led community organizing efforts in response to the United States' pervasive racial injustice through the Democracy Frontlines Fund. You may be familiar with that entity, but just for those who aren't, the Democracy Frontlines Fund's grant recipients are national organizations building sustainable local power. They are committed to reimagining safety, amplifying the voices of disenfranchised voters, and prioritizing Black, LGBTQI, youth, disabled, undocumented, and formerly incarcerated leadership. And within that $10 million package were 2 local grants, one to the Chicago Racial Justice Pooled Fund, which supports community organizing and prioritizes Black leadership and/or addresses anti-Blackness. The Chicago Racial Justice Pooled Fund is based out the Crossroads Fund and is already operational. And that is probably one fund where entities that are not yet nonprofits or not yet fully operational may be able to seek support. So I would encourage folks to look there. Secondly, the Together We Rise Fund is a new fund based at the Chicago Community Trust that will catalyze economic growth, mitigate the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, and address the racial inequities in the Chicago region. This Together We Rise Fund was announced in October, and it's not quite operational yet. A lot of work is being done by the staff at the trust and others to get its work launched. So stay tuned for more information there. Then secondly, from that initial $25 million package, $15 million was slated specifically around the November elections, and then all of the follow-on work that we will see continue. This had a nationwide focus on election administration, integrity, and voting rights protection, and then nonpartisan voter education and get out the vote efforts. Again, this was a nationwide focus, but there was a grant made to the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, which was serving as the fiscal sponsor for the Just Democracy Illinois Collaborative. And that collaborative includes work by Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Change Illinois, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Chicago Votes, Illinois Common Cause, and Illinois PIRG. And then coming back to this project I mentioned a moment ago, also in September of this year, the Ford Foundation announced a national initiative called America's Cultural Treasures, with one point of focus in Chicago. The Ford Foundation seeded the national initiative with $35 million across 6 regions: Boston, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, with local foundations pairing their own dollars with the Ford investments and, driving the design of their regional grant-making initiatives. Each region will provide matching funds for multi-year grants to cultural organizations focused on groups of color with regional or local significance. To date, several local foundations, including the Joyce Foundation, MacArthur, the Terra Foundation, and the Walder Foundation, have all pledged together $16 million for Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous arts organizations in the metropolitan region that have been hard hit by the ongoing pandemic. America's Cultural Treasures here in Chicago, the organizations selected will be supported for the vital role they play as cultural institutions. Despite their importance, these organizations have historically been under-recognized and under-resourced. The new funds are intended to provide general operating support and enable the organizations to be resilient and stable in the face of the economic impacts of the pandemic. The local funders hope this initial investment will bring greater awareness and greater support to Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous arts and cultural organizations in our metropolitan area. And then in addition to its seeding of these local initiatives across the nation, the Ford Foundation also committed another $71 million of its dollars to directly support 20 organizations that it believed were anchors of cultural diversity. And Chicago's own National Museum of Mexican Art received one of those 20 awards directly from the Ford Foundation for general operating support. America's Cultural Treasure Chicago is being developed earnestly by these local funders and others. And We hope to be able to announce more information, including very specific information on how organizations can determine eligibility and apply in the coming days. So please stay tuned for those announcements. And then I'll turn now to MacArthur's process for deploying the remaining funds it has. I only have one more slide, which is my contact information. Why don't I put that up again at the end, but I'll stop sharing for now. All right, what I've just described is the work to date. The Foundation's immediate response to the crisis has focused on short-term relief in our home communities of Chicago and the 3 countries in which MacArthur has country offices, India, Mexico, and Nigeria. Additional spending from the bond proceeds will be targeted to new work focused on medium or long-term strategies in these areas and quite possibly others. New spending is being developed through a participatory process amongst the staff and board of the Foundation and people external to the Foundation, together focusing on remaking systems to be more just, equitable, and resilient in the future. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 goals for this work: hasten an equitable recovery, seize the opportunity to create lasting transformation, and help reimagine what is possible for communities and organizations. We're looking for areas where the funds can have transformative and systemic impact, and in ways that center Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, and other perspectives of people of color, their communities, and their leaders. To determine how to allocate the remaining funds from the $125 million bond sale, we're seeking input from the communities we aim to support and taking lessons from our early experiences with participatory grant making. We've convened an advisory group of about a dozen individuals to help guide this work. These people represent a wide array of issue expertise, personal backgrounds, and geographic representation. They range from those with international experience to those deeply rooted in our local metropolitan area. We invited people who have life experience and knowledge relevant to organizational or systemic resiliency, who represent communities that are most impacted by COVID, and who possess an understanding of how to apply a racial justice lens and an anti-racism lens to the work. We intentionally sought out individuals who will bring new voices and perspectives to the Foundation, rather than only asking for advice from those whom we already know. By reaching outside of MacArthur's established networks of grant recipients and advisors, we hope and expect that these new voices will help us develop bold goals, ask hard questions, and truly hold us accountable. What's happening right now over the last several weeks and into the next several weeks, the external advisors are reviewing suggestions for the use of the bond funds from organizations around the world that have submitted their ideas to the Foundation. The external advisors are bringing their own ideas to the table, as I mentioned, asking some very hard questions, and also commenting on suggestions that have risen up from MacArthur staff members. At this moment, they are literally in the thick of it. They're working with teams of MacArthur staff to focus in on some key areas of support that the Foundation might pursue. I fully appreciate that you all would love to hear more specific details on what will emerge from this process. And I wish I could say more, but the process is unfolding as we speak and into the weeks ahead. We have learned from working with participatory grant makers in our Culture, Equity, and the Arts program that when you invite the advice of people, you need to slow down and listen to it, to engage with them rigorously, and to take their advice, to listen to what people say. So as I mentioned, these conversations are ongoing in earnest, and we hope to be able to release more information in the new year. And as mentioned earlier in response to the first question, we are committed to evaluating the work in this Equitable Recovery Initiative. We'll study the outcomes and impact of the efforts supported. We are taking advice from the external advisors on how we can measure success, what counts as progress. And we also have learned a great deal already from participatory process and intend to learn a great deal more through this process. What we do learn will be shared publicly and will inform our future work. And so just in closing, As we pursue this work, we are looking to the future. What lessons can we learn from this once in a lifetime moment? What lasting changes do we need to make as an organization? How can we deepen our understanding of racial justice grant making in a way that is enduring rather than just immediate? And to realize the promise of this moment, we know that we need to sustain our focus on anti-Black racism in particular. We look forward to the challenging work that is coming our way, to creating a learning community with other funders, and to stand in solidarity with the groups that receive these funds. I'll close there and be very glad to take your questions.
Great. We have a number of questions. I will try to get to as many as I can. Let's see here. Sorry about this. Okay, you've already talked about, I think, MacArthur encouraging other local foundations to give above and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to add anything to that, or do you feel like you've addressed that?
Well, I think I know that the Chicago Racial Justice Pooled Fund is very eager to raise additional funding and to continue its work. It has been successful thus far, but it is very much focused on movement building and sustaining organizations that are directly addressing racism. And so I think if local funders are interested, the Crossroads Fund or any of the contributors to that fund would be delighted to talk more. Also, America's Cultural Treasures Chicago would be thrilled to raise additional funding and continue that work. It's been envisioned initially as a 4-year program, but if we can raise additional funding locally or nationally, we could help more organizations with general operating support and or help organizations for a longer period of time.
Okay, here's another question. Hopefully I will be able to capture this. Regarding sustaining the sector, will any of these funds support organizations that combine with others through M&A? I'm not sure what that means, either by force due to reduced financial support or due to business decision for strategic partnerships alliances. So I guess it's like, would you guys fund collaborations?
I'm guessing M&A is merger and acquisition, probably.
Yes, sounds good.
So one thing that we're trying to pay a great deal of attention to, both through the bond proceeds work and our regular work, and certainly through the Chicago commitments local work, is how to provide greater opportunities for organizations to obtain the type of supports they've been asking for, at least that we have heard them ask for. All kinds of things from strategic planning to scenario planning, financial management, board recruitment, et cetera. So I think that we always welcome collaboration. We try not to force collaboration. We believe that a funder dictated or suggested collaboration is often not what is best for the organizations involved. So we never try to create forced marriages, but where organizations on their own decide that there is benefit in collaboration, that's always a welcome approach. I caught the M&A. I don't know if I caught the exact question there. It's not our intent, certainly, to push organizations into mergers or acquisitions unless it is something they are striving to pursue on their own.
I think you've answered the question.
Mm-hmm.
And just an FYI, some people have asked, yes, this is being recorded and it will be available afterwards. Mm-hmm. Let's see, moving along here. And I'm assuming, this is from a person, that these opportunities are available and information about them is available on the MacArthur Foundation website.
General information about the bond proceeds work is available. A lot of folks have sent us their ideas and or concept papers, and we have cataloged all of those and shared them with the internal teams of volunteers working on this and with the external advisors. So there's not, because we haven't yet determined exactly what the remaining funds will be spent on, what thematic areas, we don't have, for example, an application process specific to a topic that comes out of that process. But many people have shared their ideas with us, and they have all been cataloged and shared with the folks within MacArthur and the outside advisors that are looking at these at the use of the funds.
Okay, next question. Will foundations deprioritize funding for low-income service and housing providers in gentrifying communities with racially diverse residents at risk of displacement? If so, why?
I think the answer to that, I believe, is I'm just looking at the question, forgive me.
It's okay.
I don't imagine that foundations would deprioritize funding for low-income service and housing providers at this moment, especially in light of COVID-19, but also because I think that COVID laid bare so many of the inequities that pre-existed, that should have been obvious to everyone in advance of COVID, but are now unmistakable. So I don't believe, I'm not aware of any foundations that would shift away from funding those areas if they are priorities now.
Okay, and that will you fund organizations that focus on improvements in Native Americans on reservations?
Yes, so let me detail, I'm just pulling up my notes here. In that first package of grants that was announced in September, there were 3 specific grants made around Native American populations in North America. One is a grant to cultural survival to make very small grants in COVID relief to Indigenous communities through urgent community-centered projects that help Indigenous partners respond to the crisis in their local communities in the ways that their Indigenous traditions would recommend. There was also a grant to Native Voices Rising, again, a pooled fund making very small grants to Indigenous communities to amplify Native voices who are elevating Indigenous solutions to historic harms. And then a larger grant to an entity called the NDN Collective, which is supporting self-determination of Indigenous peoples, including efforts to improve underlying conditions contributing to poor health outcomes, but also recognizing that across that collective, there are many other needs, including litigation support, et cetera. So that was a package of 3.5 million of that initial package went specifically to Native American population-oriented efforts, and I believe some additional grants are under consideration now.
Great. Next question. Can organizations continue to send ideas, concept papers to the foundation?
Yes, what I would recommend is that you email those to me, and we'll post my email again at the end of this, and I can filter them into those conversations.
Great. There are a series of questions about the outside advisors. If you could talk a little bit more about how they were selected. Do they include Black, Indigenous people of color? Are they equitable? That kind of thing.
Yes. So what I can say is a whole lot of people, many dozens of people were recommended, nominated for these roles. And then one of our internal committees went through the painstaking task of trying to identify about a dozen that would be truly representative. So, male, female, LGBT, people of Indigenous backgrounds, people representing the various geographies where MacArthur works, people with a variety of racial backgrounds, people with different issue knowledge and expertise. We generally speaking, when we have used external advisors, we have done so with the hope of making their names public, but it's always the decision of those external advisors in the end. And in a separate opportunity, one of our first participatory grant making endeavors, we asked the external advisors to think about whether they would make our names public. And in all candor, they said, well, we'll see how this goes and we'll tell you later. So what we want to do is respect their role and enable them to be as candid and honest and outspoken with us as they want to be. And then my hope is that if we come to the end of this process and they're satisfied with how it has gone, they will enable us to make their names public.
Okay, are you viewing homelessness prevention as an area you are targeting for improving equity?
There are many ideas floating around in the conversations underway at this point. I do believe that is among them. But as I say, there are meetings and committees and subcommittees sifting through all of the ideas that have come in. So I don't want to jump out ahead of the external advisor's ultimate advice to us and suggest that they have settled on any particular topic.
Okay, next question. The Black faith community has and continues to be a catalyst for racial equity and social change, particularly in our underserved communities. Is the Black faith community a part of your advisory committee? And will faith-based organizations be considered in your grant making?
I don't want to reveal the identity of the external advisors, so I'll revert to my earlier, more generic answer describing the very, very diverse in all ways members of that group. But certainly Black faith-based organizations and other faith-based organizations would be eligible for grants if they were doing the work that is ultimately determined to be supported.
Great. Next two questions are kind of combined, and that is, what's the best way for people to stay informed about where the process is and what the timeline might be for the release of applications and a description of the review process?
I think keeping an eye on our website and then also signing up for any notifications is a good way to keep on top of things. When we have done larger announcements like the September grants awards and so on, we have, I think, both posted those on the website, tweeted them out, used social media, et cetera, in some cases a press release. But certainly the website is an easy place to always find updates.
Okay. Let's see. A question from an attendee. Sounds like that there are two groups, the advisors and the consultants. And are those two different groups? And could you talk a little bit more about them? Are they the same?
No, we have a large number of MacArthur staff from all different programs, and departments volunteered to serve on some internal committees that are doing a lot of the legwork. And then there are the external advisors. The external advisors are being compensated, but there is not yet a separate entity that we're calling consultants at this point.
Okay. Let's see here. Do you expect there to be any opportunities for conservation organizations that engage communities of color, both programmatically, but also through jobs programs? Are there opportunities for DEI work, like the fund that the Doris Foundation announced this fall?
Mm-hmm. I think, as with homelessness prevention, issues of conservation are certainly on people's minds, but I can't say exactly whether they will end up in the final set of topics that would be supported through the bond funds. MacArthur has a climate solutions program through its regular grant making, and has also traditionally done conservation work around the world. So those would be ongoing programs separate from this new initiative.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question. This person appreciates the need to slow down and listen, but of course, the work is urgent. So when do you anticipate or hope you can announce decisions in granting more of these funds? I sort of answered that, but here's another opportunity.
Right, no, I appreciate it. And we feel that urgency and that tension very much. My understanding is that we should be able to announce more information early in the new year, certainly in the first quarter of the new year.
Okay. And then this is a question I think which was asked before, but in theory, a nonprofit can apply to any or each of these foundations if they fit guidelines. It's not one application for the collaboration, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. So each of those 5 national foundations, they made their joint announcement in June because they each were taking the unusual step of raising money in different ways to respond to the pandemic. Beyond that, each of the 5 foundations is taking its own path to determining how to use those funds. And then I think the one quasi exception to that is the Ford Foundation is working with MacArthur and the handful of other local funders I mentioned on this project called America's Cultural Treasures. But for the local funding, the local funders are currently determining what the criteria and application process will be. So we will have Ford's support, both financial and moral support, if you will, for that. But that will be a local process, a pooled fund with the Joyce Foundation, Terra Foundation, Walder, and MacArthur.
Great. And then I'm assuming that you will make your slides available to forefront. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the truth is, there's nothing in these slides that isn't on our website. I am often teased at MacArthur about being the least skilled with PowerPoints. So I kept it simple, but yes, delighted to share the slides.
Great. Let's see, this has been answered. This is a general question. How will granting organizations, I guess MacArthur, prioritize existing programs versus proposed programs?
Right. I think if I understand the question correctly, the MacArthur leadership and board wanted to be highly responsive to COVID and also the racial inequities we're facing without taking funds away from existing programs. So each of MacArthur's existing programs, and certainly including the Chicago Commitment Program, are working to greatly magnify the racial justice, racial equity lens they bring to their regular ongoing work. This new funding was intended to be an infusion of new resources that would allow us to take some new approaches, again, think about reinvention, be more creative with the funding, but it would all be in addition to MacArthur's ongoing programmatic work.
Great. Will MacArthur fund advocacy efforts or staff to help nonprofits lobby elected officials to prioritize racial justice, police reform, etc.?
Yes. Forgive me for sounding overly legalistic with this answer. There are limits in federal law to the ways in which private foundation dollars can fund political activity and lobbying. So private foundation dollars can certainly support public education and other forms of advocacy, but they can't be used to directly support lobbying. So we have in the past and imagine that we will continue to fund the public education side of that equation, if you will. But we are limited by federal law such that we can't directly fund lobbying in general.
Great. Is there any support for at-risk students, K-12, whose education has been negatively impacted by COVID?
Mm-hmm. One contribution that we made over the summer as part of that initial response was to the the Kids First Chicago, Connected Chicago program. And that was specifically raising funds to ensure that those Chicago public school students without access to the technology they needed to engage in remote learning would have greater access to it. So equipment, access to Wi-Fi, et cetera. So we have made some contributions of that sort. I think the broader question of whether that would be a specific initiative under the bond proceeds work would again be one determined by the process with the external advisors.
Great. Here's a question. I know that the foundation is going to be posting information about a program as it becomes finalized. But how often do you suggest us to check the website? Like weekly, daily, monthly?
Well, I can tell, what I can say is we've had since the external advisors were convened earlier in the fall, we've had regular meetings with them. They have then signed up for more intensive work around some areas of their own interest, or where they would like to have influence in the decision-making process. All of those meetings are ongoing now, and sort of filtering up to our president, our board, and those external advisors. So I believe that process will continue certainly through the end of this year. So I don't imagine that there will be a news release or a press release before the end of this calendar year. But I know that everyone involved, as I mentioned earlier, feels great urgency around this. And so my hope is that earlier in the new year, and certainly in the first quarter, more information would be available. I don't know that that means you need to check a website every day, once a week or so, probably fine.
Great. Okay, let's see here. Will organizations in suburban Chicago be eligible for funding?
I would say the Chicago Commitment Program and MacArthur in general, we think of the Chicago metropolitan region. So we say Chicago for shorthand, but we, to the extent that we are working locally, we would be thinking of it as the metro region and not solely the city limits.
Great. Okay, here's another question. With recent increased focus on supporting smaller community-based organizations, which has been critically needed and vital to community development, what are your thoughts on larger, older, nonprofit organizations who provide multiple programs or services and supports to children, families, and communities, particularly organizations intentionally working to take an anti-racist approach, yet needing the additional support from foundations to push forward and innovate?
If I may, I'll answer that in the context of our local Chicago commitment work, but I think the same answer will likely apply when the bond proceeds work is better defined. Like many foundations, we have tried to do more direct grant making to smaller and community-based organizations, but we also work very closely with older established organizations that are providing a variety of services. So I think for us, it's been a bit of a both and. We are trying to work more directly with the smaller community-based organizations, in part because they tell us that when they receive a grant from MacArthur, it can help them in a variety of ways. So forgive me for sounding boastful, but we hear many times from the organizations that when they receive a grant from MacArthur, it can open other doors for them, doors to other funders, broader credibility, and so on. And so we know how much we learn when we work directly with community-based organizations, and we want to honor what they're telling us the benefit from MacArthur can be, aside from simply the dollars. On the other hand, we are absolutely working in partnership with other entities like the United Way, like Metro Family Services, like Heartland Alliance, and so on, in a variety of programs, many of which are directly focused on gun violence prevention in Chicago. So I don't imagine that we would veer away from either approach going forward.
Okay, another question. Many small nonprofits that work directly with impacted people struggle with the grant application procedures of large funders like MacArthur and others. Is that being taken into consideration when developing the process?
Yes, I think MacArthur is having a lot of different conversations. In addition to the bond proceeds conversation, we are engaged in an initiative called what we call the Just Imperative. And that is named as such because MacArthur's MacArthur's set of values are just, verdant, and peaceful. And just comes first, and it comes first for a reason. And so the just imperative is looking at all of MacArthur's work and how it can lead with justice and bring a greater racial equity focus to everything. That includes how we recruit, who we hire, who invests the funding, who we hire for events and catering, where we buy our supplies, in addition to all of the grant making work. And so coming back to the specific question, there are conversations about how to make the grant application process easier, more accessible, et cetera. We have a few internal procedures now that are very, very swift and easy. And we have folks trying to make those more accessible processes more widespread. So again, stay tuned in that regard.
Great. Here's a question which I think you already addressed, but let's just make sure. Are these funds intended to support only new projects or newly created projects, or will the ongoing work of current grantees also be eligible if it centers on equity, justice, access, in our respective fields?
I believe the latter, that while each individual MacArthur program is continuing with its work, there's certainly no bar on an existing grant recipient from receiving funds under the bond proceeds work if it aligns with where that work lands.
Great. Let's see. Here's a question. We received a nominal sub-grant as a fiscal sponsor for another organization that received a grant from the Crossroads Fund. Would that prevent us from receiving funding through this MacArthur stream?
No, I imagine that with the bond proceeds work, there may be a number of pooled funds to which we contribute. The Racial Justice Pooled Fund at Crossroads is a good example of that. The funds I mentioned related to Native American, Indigenous peoples are other examples of that. So there may be opportunities for entities who have received funds directly or through fiscal sponsors to seek funds, whether from MacArthur directly or from these pooled funds. So I'd say nothing would be ruled out in that regard.
Great. This is sort of a mechanics question. I'm addressing this to Key and Lisa. Will the questions and the information that Forefront has provided be available? That's the information that's in the chat. Is that something that could be captured and distributed to attendees? This is for Key and Lisa. We're not sure. We hope so. And I'll see if we can find out. Okay, now I think that we have answered all of the questions that I see. If anybody has any more, please enter them now. If not, please know that this recording will be available after the fact. Let's see, maybe there's a, oh yes, now I got a message from Key that the questions and the information provided in the chat will be available as part of the recording. Thank you, Key. I
will say for those who may not be aware, if you want to save the chat on your own, because I know Lisa has been posting some useful links there. At the bottom of the chat on the right-hand side, there's a square with 3 little dots in it. If you click on that, it will give you the option of saving the chat for yourself.
That's great. Good. That's good to know.
The trick is to save it before the call ends. I'm always frantically trying to save it after the last comment and before the host disconnects the call.
Great. Actually, there are a couple other questions which just popped up, and I will. Okay. Are there plans to engage existing MacArthur grantees in an effort to deepen MacArthur's commitment in their sustainability? If so, how will these organizations be engaged, and what communication should they be on the lookout for?
forgive me 1 second. I'm just looking at this question to make sure I understand it properly.
Sure.
I would say for the Chicago commitment team, and again, separate from the bond proceeds, we have made grants in the past that are specifically focused on institutional support. The idea being a multi-year grant for an organization to really focus on its own strength and health for the long term. Sometimes that means growth, but not necessarily. And so our team wants to continue to offer those kinds of grants. That may get to the first part of Darnell's question. We also, across the board, have been trying to find ways to offer more support for what people often refer to as technical support and capacity building. Again, trying to do that in response to what we're hearing that organizations want rather than what we're assuming they might want. So whether we do budget for some of that in our regular Chicago commitment grant budget on an annual basis, whether additional funds could be found through the bond proceeds for that work. I can say I would be delighted, but it is, again, the decision of the external advisors and the foundation leadership to ultimately decide.
Okay, here's a question which I think you partially answered, but throw it out. Will the foundation have a specific fund for DEI training for organizations like Doris Duke announced this fall?
That is an excellent question. I think for the bond proceeds, again, it would be coming out of that external advisor discussion process. Our Chicago commitment team has helped some local organizations with that specific kind of funding for training. And so we're always happy to hear from groups that are looking for that. We can't promise that we will be able to fund every entity, but we have tried to be helpful in certain circumstances in the past.
Great. Here's a question. Let's see. How can organizations provide data supporting the need, for example, COVID-19's impact in a community when it's still not available?
When the data is not available.
Yeah, I'm not, yeah. I'm just reading the question, yeah. So I'll let you respond as best you can.
Well, I guess if the geography in mind is one where there isn't data available, I'm thinking, for example, of we have the very helpful dashboard put out by the city of Chicago and updated very regularly. So we may have a luxury of data that not everyone else has, at least for our local work. I guess I would say that if there is not hard data, that anecdotal information is always welcome. And I think we all know now how pervasive COVID has been, especially in certain communities of color. So if hard data is not available to argue the case for support, anecdotal data is perfectly fine.
Yeah, and this, I don't know if this is from the same person, but I think the example, finding employment statistics right now for the West Side or the South Side or for certain ethnicities is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yes, fair enough. I think what I want to say is certainly MacArthur and other funders, in particular the Field Foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, a number of funders have been looking at a variety of indicia in areas of the metropolitan area that are hardest hit with COVID, and trying to understand how those geographic areas are receiving support, whether that's philanthropic support, corporate support, city, county, state, federal dollars, et cetera. So I certainly don't mean to suggest that that this group of funders has all the data that we need, and it certainly hasn't cornered the market on it, but I do think that there's a very strong awareness of the need on the South and West Side, pre-COVID and now, even if we don't have the exact employment statistics. I think people are aware how much communities are hurting as a result.
Great. And then also there's people are wanting to make sure that you put up the slide with your contact information because I'm sure they'll want to contact you. And let's see, and actually, I'm going to let you answer this question to define DEI training.
Oh, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so many times organizations are looking for training to improve how they address those issues and concepts at the staff level, at the board level, at the organizational or foundation level. So
great.
Screen sharing and put my contact information.
Good. Those are all the questions that I see. There's Tara's information. I think probably we can maybe draw this to a close. And again, this recording along with the chat information will be available courtesy of Key on December 4th, which is this, I guess, Saturday or Friday, excuse me. And also, I want to thank Tara again for being available and answering a variety of questions. This is a very exciting initiative and she's very accessible. And stay in touch. You'll get more information as things take firmer shape. And just a brief footnote that our next session is January 14th. It's not the first Tuesday in January, but it is in January. And there'll be more information coming out about that. I don't know if Tara, did you any sort of final words that you have for everybody?
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining today, for your excellent questions. And I'll just say, one thing you learn as a congressional staffer is that you return every phone call and every email and piece of written mail as quickly as possible. So please know that if you are in touch with me, I will follow up. I anticipate that with a couple of hundred people on this call, at least for part of it, there could be a flood of inquiries coming in. So if you don't hear from me within a short period of time, number one, please don't take offense. And number two, please feel welcome to send a reminder. I don't miss many emails, but once a year or so, something falls through the cracks and I hate for that to happen. So you can err on the side of badgering me if you feel like your inquiry has not been responded to in a timely manner.
That's great. Okay, so we'll sign off. Have a good rest of the day and see you around the virtual block.
Thank you for moderating, Rich.
Oh, you're welcome. Goodbye.